Welcome to the Twin Bill Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Bolohan. We hear a lot about the Hall of Famers who put up a career full of great seasons. But maybe more interesting are the players who've had a year of greatness and never reached those heights again. David J. Gordon's fascinating new book, Baseball Shooting Stars, tells the story of those players and their magical season. You'll definitely recognize a lot of players, but I learned all sorts of interesting facts, like how Al Rosen has the highest single-season WAR for a third baseman ever. Enjoy. Welcome to the podcast, David. How you doing today?
I'm doing great. Nice to be here.
Great to have you. Where did the idea for this book come from?
I did another book that sort of focused on Hall of Fame players, and I was thinking that it's kind of incomplete because there were a lot of players who gave us a lot of good moments over the years. Some of them just had this one good year, and I got to thinking about who would be an all-star team of players with one good season. I think I had in my other book, Baseball Generations, I did an exercise where I put a table in of who would have the highest WAR at each position. If I wanted to make an all-star team of American League and National League for every year, who would be the all-star team for one season? And there's some interesting names on the list that I never thought about. One of them was Lonnie Smith. I realized that if you look, other than Barry Bonds, no National League left fielder has ever had a higher WAR than Lonnie Smith in 1989. And I just thought, this would be a cool book because there's some people. There's some of the obvious suspects that are on the list of the All-Stars. I mean, the Barry Bonds, the Babe Ruth, and so on. But there were some people that were just like one-year wonders on that list. At first, I was thinking one-year wonders. I had trouble with defining that, so I went with a definition in this book.
You actually have a methodology here that you go by. Can you sort of go over that really quick?
In my real life, I was a biostatistics clinical trial person, so I'm always one for methodology. I decided that what I wanted to emphasize was somebody who was really, really good one year. And I wanted somebody that there was a big contrast between how good they were in that one signature season versus the rest of their career. So I didn't want to do Joe Charbonneau, for example. He was Rookie of the Year. So his WAR in his rookie year was like 2.5. He was a lousy defensive outfielder. But even his just offensive WAR was like 3 point something. And then he was nothing for the rest of his career. So he was like a flash in the pan, but not really what I was looking for with one-year wonders. I was looking for guys who had to have like a career which, if they had sustained it for a number of years, they would have been in the Hall of Fame. So I used my rough cutoff as 7 WAR season. Though I made some allowances if somebody was a catcher or something, and they don't get as many plate appearances. So I did some normalization for seasons, and then they had to be at least 50% better that year than in any other season. There's certainly some one-year wonders in the list, like say Billy Grabarkowitz is a good example, or Rick Wilkins of the Cubs. But these guys were actually 7 WAR players for one season, not 2.4 like Joe Charbonneau or I remember Hurricane Hazel when I was just basically coming into baseball consciousness. It was like just 1 month wonder. They had to have really a substantially good season. But I was going for contrast with the rest of their career. So at the other extreme, they had Billy Grabarkowitz at one end, who was like negative WAR for the remainder of his career. For 1 year, he was like 6.8 WAR. And then at the other extreme, I have Dwight Gooden. He could have been a Hall of Fame pitcher, but he was so good that 1 year. He had probably the best year of anybody since Walter Johnson that 1 year. And then the rest of the year, he never had more than 5.5 in any season. So I was really going for a contrast between how good they were in 1 year and what the rest of their career was like. And then the other thing that I was going for is I at first I was trying to be very rigid and say they had to meet this criterion. And I finally sort of gave up that idea and said, really, I want to tell good stories. There are more people. There are plenty of people who fit the criterion. If I wanted to just do a book about pitchers who started out well and got injured, I could fill a whole book with people like that. And I wanted to have some diversity of stories, and I wanted to have people who had sort of who I could get some interest out of. I try to do these as if I were writing a magazine. Each one was like trying to do a magazine article and finding something interesting about these players other than just statistics.
Yeah, you look at these guys and they're almost all stars. A lot of them have a couple awards under their belt there, MVPs in here. I was surprised by how many of these guys that people really do know had nice careers, but really did have that one season. Doc Gooden, for example, Josh Hamilton, a very recent one, MVP, a number of very good years. I didn't realize how much better that one year was
Yes.
than the other. I was surprised. Were there players that you were surprised made the book or didn't make the book under the criteria?
Yeah. Yeah, I had some preconceptions, and certainly I learned a lot in researching these players for the book. And yeah, there were players. In the last chapter of the book, I talk about some of the players who didn't make it. I was thinking maybe Fernando Valenzuela might make it for 1981, but he really, I mean, that was a good year, but he had a number of good years, right? I thought of Denny McLean, for example, in 1968, but I realized he was actually just as good, maybe even better in 1969. So there were people like that I thought. Roger Maris was another one, although I knew he won back-to-back MVP, so I didn't think he was going to be a candidate for it. But there were certainly people who had short peaks that were out of out of character with they couldn't sustain a short peak, but then it's a slippery slope. How short is short? you know.
You also leave out, I would say, almost all of the steroid guys. Your Brady Andersons, for example. What went into that decision?
Brady Anderson actually had several good years. I was thinking
Did he really?
he had one fluky year with home runs, but
Yeah.
other years where he was that wasn't his only year with greater than 6 WAR. I think that he
I'm shocked. I'm actually shocked by that. Wow.
yeah. So he had more than one good year, but I think that and Brady Anderson. Everybody thinks he used steroids. I mean, I don't know that there's any proof that he used steroids. That's the other thing. I didn't enter with the idea that I wouldn't use steroid guys. But though I wouldn't want to use a guy who used steroids one year who was really good and then didn't. That's kind of a boring explanation for why the guy was better that one year. The ones I think I had at one point I started having was looking for infielders to complete my so-called all-star team of of shooting stars, and I was looking at Marcus Giles versus Brett Boone versus Rich Aurelia, and with Brett Boone in particular, and with Rich Aurelia to some extent, there were hints of steroids, and I said, well, why not just pick a guy that there was no whiff of steroids? And I think the same thing with Javier Lopez. I actually have gone so far as write a chapter on Javier Lopez as one of my pitchers. And then I realized that there was some whiff of steroids about that career year. And I thought, well, I'll stick. I had a couple of other good candidates. I actually thought Daryl Porter was maybe a more interesting person to write about. So
He was fascinating, yeah. And I didn't know a lot about him. I really enjoyed that chapter.
I'm a pretty big baseball fan, but I didn't spend all my time following it. I mean, I had a fairly active career as a scientist, so I'm not, it's not like I follow these people meticulously. I followed maybe people who played for the Cubs or people who played for my local teams maybe a little more closely than others. But I really enjoyed getting into learning about some of the players. I knew that Daryl Porter died young, and I knew that, but I didn't quite realize how much it pervaded his career, how much the drugs pervaded his career. And he's a very, very sympathetic character. I exactly identify with him, but he's a sympathetic character in my mind. Whereas you write, or as I write about Gooden or Josh Hamilton, you sort of get, you keep wanting to slap your head because they keep, all the talent in the world and they keep screwing up. So you get more angry at people like that, but I still try to I tried to write it sympathetically anyway.
Yeah.
Um,
So, yeah, definitely. After writing this whole book about these shooting stars, We've talked a little bit about, pitchers getting injured. We've talked a little about, drug use impairing careers here. What are some of the other reasons why some of these guys have this 1 year and don't quite follow up that you found?
Well, some of them, one theme that I found, especially in sort of the characters in the 40s and 50s, was a lot of guys were probably, would have had very good careers, but were stuck in minor league systems for a long time. One of my favorites in this book is Harry Burkeen, who, again, I knew him as the pitching coach of the Orioles. I'm too young to remember his actual pitching career, but I, realized that he was just pitching beautifully in the minor leagues for many years, and the Cardinals had like 31 minor league teams under Branch Rickey in those days. And they didn't, he was a small guy, he didn't throw particularly hard. They had a lot of big, hard throwing guys, and he just never got a chance. The only thing that gave him a chance was World War II. And he got in, and he turned out to be a pretty damn good pitcher. But by then he was having elbow problems. His hero was Carl Hubbell, and he learned to throw a screwball. And I guess by the time he reached the major leagues, he couldn't. He was pitching as a swingman, sometimes sometimes he was pitching the workload that a modern pitcher would pitch today, instead of 300 innings like they pitched back in the 40s. So so there was 1 year when his elbow didn't bother him, and he had a great year. So yes, he was 33. So you say, well, okay, in some ways it's injuries. But it's injuries, and it's the combination of not getting a chance when he was healthy, and then being sort of as partially impaired pitcher when he really got a major league opportunity. But there were other guys like Jim Gentile, who didn't, was stuck behind Gil Hodges in the Dodgers system, and Tommy Holmes was blocked for a long time in the Yankee system, and then they finally traded him to the Braves, where he'd get a chance to play. And Al Rosen was stuck behind Ken Keltner at third base for a long time in his career. He's really like I was going back and forth about whether to include him in the book, because he was really a very good player for 5 years. He was like an all-star, 40 home run guy. But for some reason he was not a good defensive third baseman, and then the one MVP year he had 10 WAR, mainly because he played good defense as well as hitting 40 home runs.
Well, he in particular was fascinating to me because he had the highest single season WAR for a third baseman in history, and I would have guessed, I don't know, 50 third basemen before him. I never would have expected that. That was a fascinating little tidbit in there.
Right, and he's the guy, of course. When I mentioned about that table in the Baseball Generations book, he was the all-star third baseman for the Yankees. So I knew about him from doing that chapter in that book, and so I really wanted to include him, but I had trouble because he kept, he had several seasons where he had 40 home runs. He was also a prolific slugger in the minor leagues. His career was also delayed by World War II, so he was one of these guys who probably could have been an all-timer. He also got injured early. I think his career ended when he was, I don't know, his early 30 or 32. I don't remember exactly, but he didn't. I think 30 was his last good year, and he retired at 32.
Was there anyone in the book that you kind of came across and you're like, oh, I love this story? You didn't know about it, or you just were really sort of taken with the player, taken with the story that you came across here?
Yeah, there are probably a couple like that. One you could probably tell, but is Lonnie Smith, because I just thought he was. I just realized that the 80s were a particular time in baseball, was for better or for worse, and he like checked every box from the 80s. So I just thought he was kind of fun, and he had it seems like pretty severe mental illness at one point, and he came back from all that, and so I really kind of liked his story. I also liked Ted Abernathy because for similar reasons. He had like a reconstructed arm. He basically couldn't throw any way except that peculiar way that he did, and he somehow managed to carve out a major league career in his mid to upper 30s. And he was still pitching well when he retired. When he actually when Kansas City released him at 40, but he was actually he settled into a pretty good groove there. So I have a fondness for those guys. I also really was fascinated by some of the careers that are in distant times in baseball. It's partly imagination because the statistical records are incomplete. So you kind of try to reimagine the career of Fred Dunlap in 1880 in the 1880s, the career of Slim Jones in the Negro Leagues in 1934. To a lesser extent, Cy Seymour in the early 1900s. George Stone was another one. But these guys, the baseball was so different back then. The Slim Jones wasn't as long ago, but baseball was very different in the Negro Leagues as well. The Negro Leagues were more similar to the 1800s in the white major leagues than they are to what was going on contemporaneously.
I didn't know who Slim Jones was. Who was he? He's an interesting guy.
Yeah, he was. He looks like a left-handed version of Satchel Paige. You look at a picture of him and you think maybe you're looking at Satchel Paige because he's like a tall and very skinny and sort of a lanky build. And the difference is that he's left-handed, and he's not known because he only was basically good for 1 year. And a combination of injury and alcoholism. And of course, he was dead by the age of 25. So, and the Negro Leagues were sort of played in semi-obscurity also. He wasn't on he was on a team that won the Negro League, the Negro National League #2 championship in 1934. But it was not it was sort of an underdog team because the two powerhouse teams in that league were the Pittsburgh Crawfords, who had Josh Gibson and Satchel Paige and a number of other Hall of Fame people. And the Chicago American Giants, I think they were called, that had whatever stars were playing that weren't in the Crawfords were on the Giants. Slim Jones played for the Philadelphia Stars, and they were a fairly new team. They were new to the league, and the only player, Negro League player that I ever heard of that was on that team was Biz Mackey, who was at that time 36 years old and a part-time player. So he wasn't. And somehow the league was split into 2 seasons. The Giants won the first half of the season, and somehow Philadelphia managed to win the second half of the season, and they upset the Giants in their World Series. So, and Pittsburgh Crawfords with Josh Gibson and Satchel Paige and all weren't even in the World Series that year. So. But it's a strange competition because none of the other. I mean, those are the only teams that really play. It was an 8-team league, as I recall, but none of the other teams played very many games. So these teams were playing each other all the time. They were playing the occasional game against one of the other top 5 teams in the league, and then peppered with exhibition games. And you don't have game-by-game records. The Hall of Fame and the research library keeps files on various players. And if you look at their files, you see that you can have newspaper articles about particular games when Slim Jones pitched against Satchel Paige, and sometimes Slim Jones won and sometimes Satchel Paige won. So it was one of Paige's best years, by the way. So. The Philadelphia would not have won that championship without Slim Jones. And like you, I had never heard of him. The only reason he came up, I did a database search of people who had 7 more seasons, and there was Slim Jones right near the top of the list. So,
Wow.
I said, this is great to include one guy like that in this. I enjoy the idea. In some ways, I like going back and trying to reimagine some of these old players' careers from the what I consider baseball's ancient history before Babe Ruth. I sort of considered like ancient history, and
Yeah. Yeah.
uh,
Well, when you tell these stories about these players, a lot of them are pretty sad. Was this depressing doing research for this book?
well, I mean, no, yeah, there's, I mean, some of them are sad. I try to find some, I mean, some of them are just outright sad. Like one of the most depressing ones, I think, is Zorlo Versailles. It was basically never, I don't think he was ever happy. Even his MVP season, his career year was not, he was really, it was basically, it was good in the first 2 months, slumped in the middle 2 months, and was really extraordinary in the last 2 months. So it wasn't like an entire good season, and he totally collapsed. He was never really comfortable in the U.S. He died a sad death, and yeah. So that one I said, I thought was pretty depressing. Um, some others I thought were, uh, I mean, Slim Jones, of course, is pretty depressing because but I was more fascinated than depressed
Yeah.
by him.
Yeah.
But in a way, I think that there are a lot of you know a lot of people went on to have pretty good lives. They're not all depressing stories. I mean, if you think of it philosophically, I mean, we're all humans. Nothing lasts forever. Our careers, our lives are ephemeral, and some people, you look at somebody like, say, Tommy Holmes. I think he's a pretty happy story. You look at somebody like, I mean, even Lonnie Smith has his ups and downs, but there's you could sit back and sort of admire where he'd been. The last time he was interviewed, he seemed to be leading a pretty satisfactory life. He's not in the limelight anymore, but I don't know that people have to be.
Look at Mark Pryor's in the World Series now. He's the pitching coach for the Dodgers. Yeah. So,
So it was doing pretty well. If I were totally objective on Mark Pryor, I might have included some pitcher other than Mark Pryor in there, but I have to keep exercising the demons of that 2003 World Series. And I think it is a good story. I could have used Wayne Twitchell of the Phillies or somebody like that. Wayne Twitchell.
I was happy to see him in there because it's also hard to remember just how huge of a pitching prospect he was. He was the perfect pitcher when he came out.
Similar to Strasburg when he came in. Strasburg, another guy who's like you could say. I mean, Strasburg had a pretty good career. His career was disappointing only that the expectations were so great. And I think a lot of guys are like that. It's some of us people who are viewed as disappointing careers. It has to do more with our expectations than uh, with what they actually did. And I think some of these players, I think, came in with tremendous expectations, and some of the players came in with no expectations and managed to have a good season when you're and it's kind of, on the one hand, it's a sad story because they only had one good season, but on the one hand, it's a happy story because they got to a place where very few players ever got. I mean, people like like Abernathy. Hank Aguirre is another guy. I thought was, he really did. I mean, he died too young, but he really had a pretty good life.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so,
Well, I was gonna ask you if doing this book has changed the way you view baseball or given you more respect for these guys. Has that changed the way you view anything?
that's a good question. I I think in some ways it has. I mean, in some ways I watch a game like anybody else watches a game, and I just am caught up with the team I'm rooting for, and just you know. I don't really care about the guy's life story if he strikes out with the bases loaded and costs my team the game. I'm not at that moment in the mood to be say, well, this guy's had a tough life, and save that for another time. But yes, but I think in general, I think it makes me more. it changes my attitude towards some people because I realize even a guy like Dwight Gooden, who basically screwed up his own life and career, you realize that this guy didn't have it easy. He didn't have it easy growing up, and he didn't have it easy being the focus of all the tabloid articles. And it's not. You can walk a mile in his shoes. You wouldn't want to be there necessarily, with all the talent he had.
Well, I suppose you can look at it in a different way, where it kind of gives you hope that anyone can kind of reach these heights. They kind of sort of come out of nowhere, and it is possible to get that high, even just for 1 year. So yeah, you can kind of sort of spin it positively too, I suppose, if you want.
Right. There's some guys that you really feel, like I mean, one guy that I haven't mentioned is another one of my favorites is Bobby Shantz, the 5'6" pitcher who's actually couldn't get into the Army when he was 18 because he was only 4'11". He was like below the height limit. It's like he couldn't ride at the amusement park. But he was, one of the reasons I liked him is that he reached an extraordinary height in 1 year, and I don't know, to some extent, I suppose that was flukish, but he also he had injuries, and then he managed to actually reinvent himself as quite a good pitcher for the last part of his career. He's still pitching well when he retired. I actually remember him. I was still a Yankee fan in 1960 when the Yankees lost that World Series, and I hadn't remembered that Chance was the guy who was in there, who held the Pirates down for 5 innings while the Yankees came back, and that he was taken out with like 2 guys on base after pitching like 4 or 5 innings in relief. He was taken out, and in what eventually became a 5-run inning for the Pirates, and which the Yankees came back from again, but then Mazeroski ended the game. So
I wanted to quickly bring up my favorite story in the book, which I thought we would talk about, and it just hasn't happened yet, which is great because there's just so many good stories in here. My favorite was John Hiller.
Yes.
I didn't know. I mean, I knew the name. I knew a little bit about John Hiller. I didn't know his story. What can you say about John Hiller?
Yeah, I think that's remarkable. My field in medicine was cardiology, so I'm thinking. So I probably at the it would have been interesting looking at his medical records because I mean guys that are 30 years old don't often have heart attacks like that. And I'm wondering what his cholesterol level was or something. I'm so interested in that way. But he was a remarkably good relief pitcher. And one of the problems, I'm actually writing an article right now that hasn't been reviewed yet, but it was trying to look at great relief, trying to say what are the criteria for relief pitchers to use to evaluate relief pitchers. Saves are terrible because, John Hiller only had 125. I'm just pulling the number out of my head. I don't know exactly, but maybe like in the neighborhood of 125 saves for his career, mainly because the role of closer hadn't even been invented yet. I mean, he was only used in save situations in 1973 because he was coming back from a heart attack and people were afraid to use him for long periods of time. And even then, he had some games where he came in the first inning in relief and pitched 8 innings to get a win or something. And so saves doesn't even begin to evaluate the performance of pitchers in that era. Really, it's become an artificial. It's become a way. It's only valid after in the 1990s. You can look at players who got lots of saves, but if you actually look at how they were used, they come in with nobody out in the bases empty in the 9th inning. And if you look at the historical statistics on how often teams score with the bases with the bases empty in the 9th inning, how often are there clean innings? It turns out that if you have a 1-run lead, 72% of teams, 72% of innings are scoreless. So if a pitcher comes in in the 9th inning with a 1-run lead, he's got basically a 72% chance of successfully navigating that inning without allowing a run. If he's got a 2-run lead, it becomes 87%. And if he's got a 3-run lead, it becomes 94%. So these guys are not contributing very much to a team's victory. And you look at John Hiller, who comes in with the bases loaded in the 5th inning and a 1-run lead, and he gets out of that jam, and then he pitches 4 more innings. Chances of pitcher navigating all that is like less than 10%. So, so there's a huge difference between how relief pitchers are evaluated. But if you compare it, like John Hiller is somebody who never would have thought of for the Hall of Fame. And I sort of look at him and say, well, I'm not sure that he belongs in the Hall of Fame compared to other pitchers who, they're pitchers like David Cohn and Louis Tiant. Louis Tiant is one of my pet peeves that he's not in the Hall of Fame, and now he's dead.
That's a shame.
So but you look at, I don't necessarily look at them and say, that John Hiller is more deserving than Louis Tiant. But I wonder if you look at relief pitchers, I don't know what's a good criterion for relief pitcher in the Hall of Fame. You look at WAR; it's not fair to look at WAR because they don't pitch enough innings. It's not fair to look at saves. So the one thing that I'm proposing now is to look at saves compared to expected saves. So which is better, but it still doesn't capture somebody who Hiller was, for most of his career, was not used to get saves. He was a swing man, started some games, used in middle relief. He's sort of your high leverage reliever. So and you compare his career stats with somebody like Lee Smith, who I think is probably a legitimate Hall of Famer. But you look at Hiller and say, other than saves, Hiller had really just as good a body of work as Lee Smith. And he did it after having a near fatal heart attack.
I never expected to read this book and think like, John Hiller has a Hall of Fame case, and now I do think that. So the credit to you for that. That's great.
Yeah, so I agree that he is one of my favorite stories. Also, the other favorite that I had that I didn't mention was I'm sorry, we'll see more because I felt like it's just. That you feel like is like a Hollywood story, it doesn't seem real. I mean, this guy is like a nobody pitching in the deep minor leagues. He has a 30-win season. So Ed Barrow reads about it in the Sporting News and says, "Hey, maybe we should look at this guy." Scout tells him, "No way." Then Ed Barrow says, "I don't know. 30 wins is he's really good year. What can it hurt? Let's bring him to the Yankees," and he winds up being arguably the best pitcher on their 1920-17. I think that's one of the happy stories, I guess. It's like he's queen for the day.
That was David J. Gordon. His book, Baseball Shooting Stars, Improbable Ascents and Burnouts in the National Pastime, is out now from McFarland. To close us out, we have Charles Rammelkamp reading his poem from our upcoming 17th issue.
The First Lady of Baseball. During her time in the White House, Mother rooted for the Washington Senators, became known as the First Lady of Baseball. "You may not give a hoot for the sport," she told her friends, "but to me, it is my very life." The American League sent her a yearly pass sealed in a gold-trimmed purse. Bucky Harris, the Senators' manager, called her the most rabid baseball fan I ever knew in the White House. The Coolidges attended Harris's wedding in October 1926. Mother attended as many games as she could, faithfully filling out her scorecard, and when they were on the Mayflower, the presidential yacht sailing down the Potomac, she tuned in the Senators' games on station WRC. When the Senators clinched the pennant in 1924, Mother and Father attended the first game, the World Series starting in Griffith Stadium, Walter Johnson, 36, on the mound. I was just starting Amherst, my brother, Calvin Jr., only 3 months dead. The score tied 2-2 after 9 innings. Father got up to leave. Mother, wearing her good luck necklace, 7 ivory elephants, yanked him back into his seat. She snapped, "Where do you think you're going?" Father sat back down to watch the Giants win in 12, 4-3. The Senators won the series in 7. Another nail-biting 12-inning game, Johnson getting the final win in relief, though he'd lost the first 2 games he'd started. Exultant fans carried him to the president, who said in his characteristic, understated way, "Nice work. I'm glad you won." But Mother, she jumped for joy.
We talk to people in and around baseball literature every week on the podcast and publish around 50 writers every year in the Twin Bill Literary Journal. You can support us on Patreon. Until next time,